Say, come to think of it, I haven't given Rocksteady's new terrible, awful game a moment of thought since it came out. Let's have a look and see what those guys are up to. Yeah, that looks about right. Mrs. Freeze? Really? You're gonna fall back on the same tired multiverse tropes that everyone and their grandma is using for their stories these days, and you're not even gonna try and be even vaguely imaginative with it? The absolute most creative thing you can think to do is take an established character and change their gender around? That's the limit of your imagination? If you needed an ice-themed woman villain, then Killer Frost is like right there, guys. Not that it really matters much, since no matter what character you pick, they're still going to be running around and capping people like it's a round of Fortnite. And just look at this design. Everything about Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League's design is so confusingly bad, it's bewildering how they came to some of the design decisions they came up with. It feels like an act of industrial sabotage at this point. But in pondering the awfulness of this game, it did lead me towards an interesting thought experiment. What would an actually good Suicide Squad game entail? I should say I have absolutely no experience or training when it comes to game design, but on the other hand, I'd be genuinely shocked if I came out with anything that would somehow sell worse than this game. This whole thing is mainly just for fun, but if you happen to like any of the ideas I present, maybe leave a comment or your own insights down below. And oh gosh, I'm just so clumsy, I accidentally stuck a big picture of my Patreon up. Oh, I'm gonna have to remember to edit this out later. Open world sandbox is kind of the default that a lot of superhero games veer towards, especially nowadays, but I don't think it's an ideal fit for every character, and I really don't think it's a good fit for the Suicide Squad. For one thing, you really have to contrive a scenario to explain why these insane wanted criminals are being let run free through a city, which leads to a terrible story like the one Kill the Justice League uses. And for another thing, it would just generally be nice to have a bit of variety in this genre, and hopefully avoid being pulled into the whirlpool of grey Ubisoft sludge.
I suck. I suck. I suck.
So what, by my estimation, would be a good fit for Suicide Squad? Well, at its core, Suicide Squad is about a secret government organization that gets sent off on impossible missions, where the odds are against them and there's a very high chance of being killed in action. And you know what gaming franchise I think of when I hear secret government organization facing impossible odds? I'm sure that, at a glance, combining XCOM with superheroes seems like a weird idea. I hear Midnight Suns did something like that, but I never played it. Apparently a lot of people didn't play it. But the idea of being in control of an entire base, managing the gear and equipment of your various supervillains, and then dispatching them on Black Ops missions around the world, the more I think about it, the more it just feels like a natural fit for Suicide Squad. Maybe you start off with a really crappy rundown base, but the more you prove yourself to your government superiors and the more money you liberate from your various targets, the more you can upgrade the facilities of your base. Maybe there could be missions where you forcibly recruit mad scientists, and in doing so, unlock new gadgets you can equip the squad with. If you wanted to try a loud, guns-blazing approach on your missions, you could put guys like Solomon Grundy or Firefly on your team, and if you wanted to be more subtle and sneaky, you could use characters like Deadshot or Bronze Tiger. And when it comes to permadeath, I figure that's something players should be able to choose if they want to have on or off. Yes, I know that kinda goes against the whole spirit of XCOM, but unlike XCOM, these are named characters. You don't have an infinite supply of them to work with. I know there are those listening who will hear the term XCOM and think turn-based combat, and in turn they will think there's no way that would have any sort of mainstream popularity. But, well, firstly, again, it will be very difficult to make something that somehow sells worse and is less popular than the actual video game Warner Brothers came out with. Secondly, I think it's safe to say a lot of the weird stigma that surrounded turn-based combat has petered out in recent years. Baldur's Gate 3 has a very tactical, granular turn-based combat system, and it was undoubtedly one of the most popular games of last year, managing to have real mainstream success.
We finally made it. The time has come to say fare thee well to the land of Ear-lay Axes, and stride fearlessly into the new frontier that is La'anch.
Thirdly, a tactical turn-based approach would really allow players to take advantage of the sheer variety of abilities a team of supervillains would actually have. When it comes to superhero team games, we've seen every character plays the exact fucking same and runs around with assault rifles, or we've seen every character has their powers and abilities but they hit like wet tissue paper, or the team are running around using all their flashy abilities and superpowers while you're stuck playing the weakest and least interesting member of the team. At this point, I want to try something a little bit different. It's the kind of game design that would allow for actual build variety and tactics and replay value, things like that. I think it's safe to say that Harley Quinn is bound to be a core member of the roster. I don't think she really works as a Suicide Squad character, but by this point in the public consciousness she is one, so let's not fight it. Deadshot and Captain Boomerang are also core members of the roster and are very closely entwined with the Suicide Squad IP, so they're guaranteed to be there from the get-go. Or, given how absolutely dope James Gunn's Suicide Squad was, you could always substitute Deadshot for Bloodsport.
It's your mom!
While those are the characters I think should be included by default, I believe that players should have at least 6 Suicide Squad members they can choose from the get-go, and then over time they end up recruiting and expanding their roster. And furthermore, I believe that the next 3 characters should be rather distinct from the other 3 I mentioned, so you're not stuck with a bunch of squishy ranged characters. Solomon Grundy should be your slow but very strong tank, and Deathstroke can be a melee fighter with a great deal of versatility in his moveset. Lastly, for a bit of a wildcard bizarre pick, maybe somebody like Clayface or Black Manta. As I mentioned earlier, the roster of available supervillains you can put on your team would expand the deeper you get into the game. In some cases, these would be villains you defeat on missions and then forcibly recruit to your cause. In other cases, these might be characters that are locked behind tech tree progression, like Hypothetically, if your version of Task Force X has a large amount of money and a lot of science facilities, Mr. Freeze would be willing to work with you on the condition that he can use those facilities to heal his wife. Or, if you've made a stockpile of magical trinkets, someone like Felix Faust would be more willing to collaborate with your team.
Here's a wand with a silencer on it. Why? But I ask again, why?
And since this is a modern video game we're talking about here, you can, of course, have other characters added as DLC down the line. When it comes to plots, I don't think the Suicide Squad really works all that well if they're dealing with big cosmic world-ending threats. They're meant to be disposable assets that can be sent off on unpleasant missions and disavowed if anything goes wrong. I'm not gonna trust Harley Quinn with the fate of the world. I wouldn't trust Harley Quinn with anything sharper than a fucking crayon. So, to start with at least, I believe that the first few missions to ease the player into things should be more low-stakes Black Ops stuff reminiscent of the original Ostrander comics. But after a few missions spent dealing with foreign armies and small criminal organizations, it increasingly becomes clear that there's some grander conspiracy at play that ramps up more and more over time. The main thing I draw inspiration from for the overarching story of this game isn't necessarily a Suicide Squad one, but it does fit the team really well. I'm talking, of course, about a mini-series from the early 2000s called Villains United. For anyone not in the know, and I imagine that's a rather sizable group, Villains United was a mini-series that was launched in the lead-up to Countdown to Infinite Crisis. The basic premise is that a small team of supervillains found themselves in a shadow war against a much larger group of supervillains called the Secret Society. The Society were a pretty big deal, not only for their massive size and members, but because they were being led by big names like Lex Luthor and Black Adam. And And the other side of this conflict, the Secret Six, were essentially a bunch of C-list second-string underdogs. Again, this wasn't a Suicide Squad story, but the general setup of a small team of underdogs going up against a massive conspiracy just fits Suicide Squad really well. It's the kind of plot that allows for a very steady escalation of the stakes and also allows you to include many famous iconic villains throughout DC history as boss fights. Of course, for the sake of simplicity, this adaptation would forego including any of the extra context that surrounded Villains United, especially cutting out any references to the multiverse. I am just so very sick and tired of multiverse stories. That's a whole other video.
This is not okay. This needs to stop now.
The overarching plot of this hypothetical game would be as follows. The Suicide Squad ends up finding out about the secret society after dealing with a few preliminary missions. From there, things steadily ramp up as the Suicide Squad takes out a few major operations and players within the society, taking out the various leaders one by one until the supreme commander of the society is dealt with. Let's just keep it as Lex Luthor for simplicity's sake. It's the kind of plot that I think is a bit more reflective of the Suicide Squad's actual skill level, and you can have a very steady, logical progression of stakes with it, instead of just starting right out of the gate with let's put these 4 mental defectives against a team of demigods and have them plot armor their way to victory. Oh, yeah, and it should probably go without saying, but this plot wouldn't be tied to any pre-existing DC continuity. I mean, you'd have to be pretty damn boneheaded to do something stupid like, oh, I don't know, randomly make this into a sequel to the Arkham series.
And how can you not make money with such a brilliant idea?
I'd be lying if I said I didn't find the Suicide Squad to be overexposed in the modern day, but clearly there's something about the core premise that's just really appealing for storytelling. And I do think it's entirely possible to make a good, compelling video game with the IP. It's just that Warner Brothers, for whatever reason, decided to go about it in the worst possible way they could think of. Do I think a good Suicide Squad game needs to follow the exact format I laid out? No, not exactly. There are other options. But I do think the format that I described would be a really good fit for the tone and themes of Suicide Squad as an IP. Do I think Warner Brothers would ever make a game like this? Also, no, I don't think so. You see, that's a good idea, and Warner Brothers doesn't do good ideas anymore.